Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for supporting the show. And I'll take the week off from doing a hard pitch. But if you do want to learn more about the Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. And if you'd like to support the Jefferson Hour, there's a donate button. We really appreciate it. We don't take any, neither Clay nor I take anything personally from this. It's maintenance and keeping things going. And lastly, email us. You can do that through the site, and we love getting questions for Clay, for Mr. Jefferson, or just suggestions. And I've said this before, and I swear to it, it's true. I read every piece of email that comes in and file them away. In fact, I think we may answer some questions next week. But with that, pretty fun show this week. Do you want to set it up, Clay?
Yes, I believe you said that I ranted, but I met this wonderful man, Tom.
Yeah.
And we were on a coach in France. We went on this cultural tour of France with 25 people. And we went to Paris, and we went to Nîmes, and we went to Nice, and we were on the Canal de Midi, and so on and so forth. It was fabulous. And one day he said, I have an idea for a program for you. And so he laid it out, and I said, yes, do. Send me the email, and I promise you we'll do the program. It's a great idea. So here we are. So thanks to Tom Bergen for this lovely suggestion. And people, send in more. We'd love to do programs that people suggest. So the question was, what are Jefferson's core principles? And he also, I think, in his own mind, was sort of playing them out in other world leaders and saying, where does Churchill fit in this? And where does Abraham Lincoln fit in this? And so on. And
Yes.
that's an interesting part of this, too. Jefferson had certain qualities that I think nobody else has had. A kind of Zen-like humility, for one thing. But he also was a passionate believer in human possibility. So if you take the kind of silly rhetoric of our political culture off the table and really say, who amongst us has a passionate commitment to human possibility? That's a really good way to decide who you want to put into power, because it's clear to me that we will solve the problem of global climate change. It may take some very, very tough transition times, but we will do it. I feel certain of that. I think human ingenuity is nearly infinite. We will move from strength to strength. I'm basically with Yuval Harari that we're going to solve almost every problem of health, of distribution of food, of pandemics, and we'll probably even overcome war through the transparency of our media. I'm a big optimist for the long run. I'm not an optimist in the short run. I think we've really put ourselves into a paralytic condition here. But I'm an optimist, and I think Jefferson was an optimist, and I think we need to hold our public officials accountable according to their level of honest and earnest and thoughtful belief in the human project. So if ever anyone was that person, it was Thomas Jefferson. Sometimes he seems like Pollyanna to us, but we need idealism. We desperately need idealism at the center of our national aspirations.
Agreed. And you are showing your optimism when it comes to climate change. I'm not sure I can go there because of the kind of changes that are needed are going to take so long.
They needed to start 10, 15, 20 years ago for us to have a
50
reasonable...
or, in the 70s, I think. Probably.
Here's what's so interesting to me. I think that this is a grave issue. I believe that government has been very slow to act, and our political party system really damages any chance that we could look at this rationally. But I think that corporations are attending to this. These corporations are filled with people of extraordinary creative intelligence and resources. And I think that industry is beginning to really dig in on this question. And I think we're going to see the leadership come not from government. Government will lag behind. The leadership is going to come from Silicon Valley and from Austin, Texas, and from Milan in Italy, and from Cambridge University in Great Britain, and so on. And that the leadership is going to come from the private sector, not the public sector, or more will come from the private sector than the public sector. And I think this is already well underway. And we're going to see some breathtaking changes. You and I still in our lifetime, and our children are going to see breathtaking changes that we can hardly even begin to calculate.
I admire your optimism. I agree with it to a certain extent, but I would, the Adamsite cynic in me would come out and say, well, yeah, if you're going to trust corporations, you have to be realistic about it. And the reason they're going to do it is because there's profit in it.
That's how capitalism works, and it runs amok a lot of the time, but it also is the engine with which innovation can really triumph under the right circumstances. So this is one of the 3 or 4 issues of any government, which is how to turn loose human enterprise without letting it damage the capacity of a society to have something like equal access to opportunity and equal rights. And everyone toys around with this at one level or another. There are the libertarians on the one end, and then there are the kind of the super duper leftist liberal politicians on the other that would have a managed society. And in between, there are all sorts of positions. But I think that this is one of the things that every society has to wrestle with. And we're not wrestling with it very well, I don't think, but I think we will. I think that human need is such that it has to get attended to.
There's some optimism in me too, but before we go to the show, I have to go back and address your comment about your rant. That was not in any way meant to be disparaging. That's why people listen to you, is they like to hear that, and it was great. And we're drifting pretty far from the concept of the show. And once again, we need to thank Tom Bergen for sending this in and doing all that work. He had these great charts comparing different nations, which were a little complex and hard to get into, but very interesting.
Well, I do thank Tom Bergen, and I'll continue in dialogue with him about the more specific sets of comparative statistics and data that he has in mind. It's a very worthy project. And I've spent the fall on the road. So I've been in Italy, I've been in England, I've been in France, and this has enabled me to see both through the window and the mirror these other ways that societies go about their business. And we had this, I'll just tell you this quick anecdote. We had this wonderful woman from Cabo on the France trip, and she is a very enchanting, deep conservative. Deep conservative. Her view is basically everyone has to swim for himself, period. So we were in France, and of course, France is a very managed society. It's a social democracy. Cradle-to-grave healthcare works very well. Cradle-to-grave educational systems works very well. Old age pensions, 2 months of paid vacation every year, paid family leave, etc., etc., etc. It's a socialist country. Or more precisely, it's a social democratic country. And they're not taxed to death. In fact, their net taxes are about the same as ours. It is a more regulated society. You can't just throw up an air conditioner on the side of the Eiffel Tower. But at the end of the trip, when we lived in splendor in France for a week, and I say a week, so, grain of salt, I said to her, well, you've seen this social democracy here, this semi-socialist country. Do you feel any better about socialism than you did a week and a half ago? And she said, absolutely not. And I said, well, our work is done, because the question is what works. The question is always what works. So you have the President of the United States proposing to, lop off $10,000 worth of student loan debt for 40 million Americans. That's sort of like putting a Band-Aid on a dam that's falling apart. We do remedial stuff for the worst problems that come, but we don't ever just say, what would a rational higher educational system look like? What would a rational healthcare system look like? What would a rational immigration policy be? And these are answerable problems. And I'm not saying that the answer is Europe, but the answers are out there. These are not intractable problems. We've just made them difficult by just some orneriness, some kind of don't tread on me orneriness at the center of American life. And of course, we have to blame Jefferson a little bit for all of that. But as you say, we stray. I'm glad some letters come in saying more of the podcast introduction.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that. Next week, I'll get that letter.
Be that as it may, but this was a really interesting program, I thought. I'm so glad that you brought Mr. Jefferson into it, David, and let everyone go to the show. And, just to say this much more about the season, it is tax deduction time. So if you want to give to the Jefferson Hour, now is the right time.
Shall we go to the show?
Let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated before me is President Thomas Jefferson. Good to see you today, Mr. Jefferson.
Good day to you, sir.
Mr. Jefferson, I'd like to suggest a conversation prompted by a listener, Mr. Tom Bergen. He asked that you discuss what he referred to as your core principles. Would that be all right, sir?
Yes, has he outlined them?
He has, and I've got some notes before me, and I'd like to begin the conversation by noting that you spent some 40 years in public service, but when I think of the principles of yours, I think of the epitaph you composed for yourself, which does not mention this public service. You wrote that you wanted, quote, the following inscription and not a word more. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of the American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. It was these, you said, as testimonials that I have lived, I wish to be most remembered. These three items, sir, to me sum up your core principles. Is that fair?
Well, they, in some ways, encapsulate my core principles. I'm not certain that they entirely sum them up. I'd like to make the distinction between public service and public offices. I didn't choose to be remembered as the third president of the United States or the first Secretary of State or the minister to the court of Louis XVI in France, etc. Those are offices. And truly, I regarded them as you might regard jury duty, that this is something you do because it's important that citizens sacrifice their personal happiness for the public good, that citizens enable themselves to be called out by their community, by their neighbors, to perform public services. And I was willing to do that, not particularly eager. I'm something of a homebody. But those offices I regarded as important to the development of our republic, but they were not particularly satisfying to me, certainly not as by way of giving me a public reputation. But the achievements that came through some of this, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, I happened then to be a member of the Second Continental Congress. But that office was less important than the thing that I was able to do, which is to write this document. The Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty is something that I wrote soon after the war began, soon after our Declaration of Independence. It wasn't passed into law until 1786, and then largely thanks to the work of my closest friend, James Madison. That bill, which separates church and state in Virginia and declares the human conscience to be utterly free and uncoercible, that is more important than being a sheriff or being a justice of the peace or being even the governor of the state of Virginia. Then finally, in my retirement, I wanted to perpetuate our revolutionary principles. So this gets closer to the idea of core principles than the other two. I wanted to find a way to perpetuate our Republican system, committed to the rights of man, believing that humans are capable of self-government, believing in majority rule. The only way to do that is to educate the next generation. We're born with the right to liberty, but we're not born with the skill to govern ourselves. That takes training. And so the university was in some part designed to pass the values of the American Revolution on to the next generation and the next, and I hope it's still doing so in your time.
Let's look at those three in depth, sir. From the Declaration of Independence, I take away the message the consent of the governed. Would that be your main point?
My main point is that people have a right to revolution, that everyone is governed. No matter where you happen to be born on earth, whether it's in Ceylon or Moscow, you will be governed. There is some social compact there. It may be a tyrannical one, it may be an appalling one, but there is a system of government. So people have the right to either leave that jurisprudence, to emigrate and go somewhere where life is better attended to, or they have the right to overthrow that government if it doesn't pay attention to their rights and their needs. So, yes, there's a social compact. People have a right to self-determination. That's central to the Declaration of Independence. But even more important is that if their government becomes sloppy, confiscatory, inefficient, wasteful, impudent, if it begins to trample on their rights, the people have not only a right to overthrow that government, but in some circumstances, a moral duty to overthrow that government, and as I put it, institute new government more in line with their aspirations. And so it's a revolutionary document that argues in the public sphere that we have a right to revolution under certain circumstances.
Well, then let's look at the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Obviously, it is geared towards religious freedom, but I take away that it's of reason and free inquiry.
Yes. Each of us is born into a community. Almost every community has a religious structure of some sort. I happened to be born in Virginia, so I was an Anglican. If I had been born in Connecticut, I might have been a Presbyterian or a Congregationalist. If I had been born in Maryland, I might have been a Catholic. We absorb a set of systems and values and procedures and rituals and liturgies from the place we happen to emerge. And I happen to be a Virginian, and therefore I'm an Episcopalian by affiliation. But as we grow up, we begin to question some of these doctrines and some of these systems. We ask ourselves difficult questions. Is there a God? If so, what are his intentions? Does he answer prayers? Did he send his son to be sacrificed for our redemption? What is expected of us? Is Allah different from Yahweh? Is Yahweh different from the Buddha? Is the Buddha different from the Manitou of the Algonquin Indian tribes? As we grow into maturity, we begin to ask ourselves serious questions about these things, and we should never do it in a scoffing or irreverent way. We should do it with the deepest sense of earnestness and sincerity. But as I began to think for myself, I couldn't be a Trinitarian. I couldn't believe in 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, the Christian concept of the Trinity. I couldn't believe in the virgin birth. I couldn't believe in the miracles. I couldn't believe in the raising of Lazarus, or for that matter, the resurrection of Jesus. I frankly didn't believe that he was the Christ. And so then I thought, well, here I am in an Anglican community where I'm required by law to attend Anglican services. I'm required by law to pay taxes for the upkeep of the church. I can be fined for non-compliance. How is that free? I should be free to formulate for myself what I believe about these essential questions, and if they differ from that of the community that I'm in, that should be no penalty. That should not marginalize me or cause me any legal or financial or social grief. So I believe very strongly in this principle, sir, that the mind is utterly free, that the state has no right to intrude into your conscience. The state has a right to force you to obey the law, but the state can't force you to believe in this God or this Redeemer or the Holy Spirit or anything else. The mind is utterly sovereign with respect to our conscience, and the state is always mistaking itself and acting tyrannically if it attempts to coordinate our religious affiliations or sensibilities. And so that bill, which was, as I say, passed in 1786, is maybe the most important thing that I ever did. And it became famous even in my time. When I went to Europe in 1784, I was well known already for the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. not nearly so well known for the Declaration of Independence. In fact, most people had no idea that I was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence.
The last item, sir, from your epitaph is father of the University of Virginia. And I think many people think that its pride in its design, its architecture, and deservedly so. But your statement about it was the diffusion of knowledge among the people. And I suspect that is the more important point.
Yes, a republic is a very interesting system of government because instead of having an aristocrat or a king or a high priest, some one entity that makes decisions for the rest of us on our behalf, ideally, instead of that, in a republic, every citizen participates in the government of the community in which he lives. And to do that well, we have to have some training. We have to understand natural rights. We have to understand the artificiality of any government. We need to know how the fruits of life are distributed across a community. We need to know what a community needs to do to protect itself from foreign invasion and so on. There's a long list of things that any polis, any polity must do. And although we have instincts and common sense, this is a universal birthright, we still need some actual civics training. So I wanted to make sure that the principles of 1776, this remarkable new start for humanity in the New World, would not diminish over time or be extinguished altogether, but that it would perpetuate itself from one generation to the next, and that needs to be inculcated by way of a strong, small R Republican curriculum. And so, yes, the architecture is handsome. I'm proud of it. The lawn is I think, pastoral and beautiful. I'm very pleased with it. It became a template for colleges and universities in the United States. I think it's a symbol of enlightenment in addition to everything else. But its real purpose is to create over generations the principles of people who can govern themselves rationally and with good sense.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. We need to take a short break from this conversation, but when we come back, Mr. Bergen has a number of specific items that he would like you to comment on, and when we return, I'll present those to you with your permission, sir.
Of course, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And this week we're speaking with Mr. Jefferson about his core principles, prompted by a letter from a listener, Mr. Tom Bergen. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, citizen.
As I said, I wanted to ask you some specific items that Mr. Bergen submitted for you to comment on. And the first is, the people are sovereign. You wrote to Joseph Willard in 1789 saying, "Liberty is the great parent of science and of virtue, and a nation will be great in both ways in proportion as it is free."
Yes, the people are sovereign. Sovereignty over time has existed in a range of different ways. So in an absolutist system, if it's King James I in England or Louis XIV in France, the king is sovereign. All power comes from him. In other systems, there might be an oligarchy or an aristocracy, and they are the sovereign. But here in the United States, the people are the sovereign. The people of the United States hold all the authority of this republic in their own hands, collectively. And they make their will known from time to time by way of elections or by persuading their representatives to do the right thing. But the sovereignty is in the people, and as I said with respect to the Declaration of Independence, if the people feel that that sovereignty is not being well attended to by their chosen representatives, whether it's the president or a senator or a governor or a justice of the peace, the people have a right to dismiss those representatives and to choose better ones. And if the system becomes so hidebound that there's no remedy within the electoral process, then the citizens, because they have this sovereignty in their hands, have the right to dissolve that government and to substitute for it a new and better one. And so this is a key of the United States of America, that here the people are sovereign. A king like James I of England, who began his reign in 1603 and ended it at his death in 1625, actually believed that he was divinely touched, that God himself had intended James of Scotland, James I of England, as he was then known, to be the sovereign over several millions of people in England, over the entire population, that this is known as the divine right of kings. It's insane. It's absurd. First of all, no one person can assure the rest of us that he is God's chosen representative on earth. That takes some boldness, some hubris. But secondly, God didn't intend monarchy. God intended freedom. And when we come into a polity, when we create a social compact, create a government, the idea is for the people to yield to that government only such functions as they prefer not to do themselves. But they have not yielded their sovereignty to that government. They've only entrusted that government to do things on their behalf.
Mr. Bergen's next point for discussion is limited government. You wrote, sir, every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves, therefore, are its only safe depository.
No question about that. And here's I suppose you'd say, the political or sociological truth. That if you create a government with great idealism and purity of intention, and it is reined in and kept from extending itself beyond the powers you have granted to it in the written Constitution, that's all fine and good. But over time, the people will begin to go to sleep and will pursue their daily interests. And the government will begin to aggrandize itself and take on new functions and create new offices and new bureaus and intrude itself more and more into the lives of the economy and into the private lives of its citizens. This is inevitable. I'm a deep student of history, and I know of no time in the history of the planet when a government, no matter what it was at the beginning, didn't grow and become sloppy and hidebound and wasteful and maybe tyrannical. And so once you create a constitution, you can't go to sleep. Now you have to guard it. And to guard it from doing things that were never intended, you have to show eternal vigilance. And that's why when I got into the great dispute with Hamilton over the Bank of the United States in 1791, it wasn't about a bank, really, although the bank was a bad idea. It was about constitutional interpretation. And Hamilton's view was that the Constitution is elastic, that it should grow with the country, that it should do things that maybe weren't enumerated or even contemplated by the men who crafted it in Philadelphia. My view is exactly the opposite, that a Constitution has a restraining power, that we enumerated the things that government could do, coin money and conduct foreign policy and wage war and tax its citizens. We enumerated those things in Article 1 of the Constitution of the United States because we wanted to limit government to do those things and not other. But Hamilton comes along just a few years after ratification and says, oh, no, we need a bank. And the bank's not enumerated in the Article 1, so let's just do it because we believe in the general welfare of the country, because we think it's a useful thing to do. Well, once you go down that path, government is going to find other useful things to do and is going to stretch the necessary and proper clause and the general welfare clause of the Constitution until you essentially have no constitutional restraints whatsoever. And so the people need to stay awake, and they need to be deeply suspicious of government at all times. And they must understand that government is going to try to do things that government is not intended to do. And if you're not pretty ornery about that, you will eventually live in a sloppy and maybe tyrannical system.
Mr. Bergen points out also that you were a strong believer in individual self-reliance and I would say and self-sufficiency, correct?
Of course, every person should be self-sufficient if he can. I mean, if you live on an island and you're alone and you wake up in the morning and you're hungry, you're going to go find food. You're not going to wait for God to deliver manna or for some ship to come to port and leave you a loaf of bread. If you want to eat, you have to go out and plant wheat or oats or gather up coconuts or breadfruit. If you want to, if you have another neighbor, let's say there are 2 or 3 or 5 families. Now, if you want to have a bridge over the creek, you either have to build it yourself or you have to cooperate with your neighbors in order to do it. But things don't just happen. Things aren't done for you. You need to be self-sufficient. And in the ideal world, if there were one, every single human being would be 100% self-sufficient. In other words, everybody would work, everybody would pay their bills, everybody would raise their children, everybody would pay their taxes, everybody would obey the laws, everybody would respect their neighbor's property and their neighbor's rights, and we would need no government. We'd be self-governing in the fullest sense of the term, and we would be self-reliant. Now, that doesn't always work. But with the great land base we have in the American West, the Louisiana Purchase and beyond, we should have hundreds and hundreds of years of safety because there's always free land out beyond the horizon for people to take up, as opposed to, say, Paris or London, where you have a permanent unemployed class. And so as long as we can be self-sufficient, we will be happy. At some point, especially if you create cities, you're going to have a dependency class, and you're going to have to decide how to handle this, because if you don't either get them work or get them relief, they're going to rob banks. They're going to go take what they need. In other words, not everybody accepts the challenge of self-reliance. There are people who are mentally feeble or physically debilitated, and there are people who are just lazy. And this creates a terrible problem for government. But ideally, if we have an agrarian system and a good public educational system, the fewest possible percentage of the population will be dependent.
Fair enough, Mr. Jefferson. We understand your principles. I know that you had a number of poverty proposals to deal with those less fortunate. But what about slavery, sir? This is an issue that goes against the grain of many of the things that you stated today.
Yes, and of course my dependency on slave labor would seem to make me at least potentially a hypocrite in talking about self-reliance. So I simply accept that. I would just put it this way on this occasion. Slavery is almost a visitation of darkness that came to the New World beginning in 1619, and it befuddled us, and it's tragic, and I am myself complicit in that tragedy. I perpetuated that tragedy. And in some ways, it has to undermine all that I have been saying today about an ideal America. But I don't want to get stuck there. I'm certainly willing to acknowledge my guilt and complicity here, but I don't think that my principles are necessarily shattered just because I was so imperfect an embodiment of those principles in this one respect.
There are many Americans today who do discount your achievements just based on that. Every generation commits sins. Some generations' sins are darker than others, but let us move on. I wanted to ask you about fiscal responsibility and restraint. And, sir, forgive me, I'm not asking about your personal finances. I'm asking about government finances.
I advocated a balanced budget provision in our Constitution. As you know, I wasn't one of its crafters. I was in Europe at the time. And I hope that we would have an amendment requiring a balanced budget. And here's why. People don't like to pay taxes. They do so because they are committed to the Republic and they understand that it's an important social responsibility. But they want those taxes to be used very carefully. And if you have a balanced budget, this forces government to make hard choices about what programs to fund and at what level. But if you can borrow monies, not only does this create conditions of inflation and the destabilization of the value of our system, but it allows government to begin to do other things that, in other words, the tether, the leash that we have on government begins to slip away when government can simply borrow instead of come to us and ask us for an increase of taxes. So we need to keep a handle on spending in government by insisting that it balance its books and that it pay its bills on an annual basis. And it goes further, sir, because a government that can borrow is a government that can wage war. If you have a system in which government gets a percentage of our income for taxes, and then it creates a budget using all or most of that annual revenue, and then it wants to go to war with Canada or it wants to go to war with Mexico, that government has to come back to the people and say, this emergency has come up. We're going to have to fund this war. Our best estimates are that it's going to cost such and such millions of dollars. We're therefore going to have to tax you more to pay for that. If that were the case, if government, every time it wanted to go to war, had to come to us and say, your taxes are going up and they may be going up severely and we need you to decide whether you authorize this war, sir, there would be no wars. Or such wars as we had would be purely defensive wars of absolute necessity. But there would be no frivolous wars. There would be no so optional wars. There would be no wars of pride or envy. If the people can hold in the capacity of government to spend, governments will live more modestly and will not become adventurers in the world's arena.
Sir, I understand your point, and I in principle, sir, I agree with you, but we as citizens elect officials in good faith, and we trust them to make the right decisions, be it war or other things. Where does that line get crossed? I mean, it may be that government knows things that we don't know, and decides that we have to do some kind of military action in order to prevent future entanglements or future disasters for the United States. Where is that line, sir? When do we not trust those officials?
Well, the founding fathers at Philadelphia, the 55 men who created the Constitution, were pretty strong on this. They said that all wars had to begin in the House of Representatives. They can't begin in the executive, although the executive can, of course, defend our coasts and harbors temporarily. They can't begin in the Senate. They have to begin in the House. And why? Because the House is that body which is closest to the people. So on two questions, war and revenues, the founding fathers at Philadelphia said those pieces of legislation have to start in the House of Representatives. And that wasn't some sort of a sop to the House of Representatives. It was a principle that the House, being close to the people, will then consult the people before it does any dangerous things. So if you're going to have wars that the executive takes on prior to explicit legislation enabling it by the House of Representatives and by the Congress, then you want presidents of the very highest character. Give me George Washington. Give me James Madison. Give me John Adams. But don't give me Aaron Burr. Don't give me Andrew Jackson. You need your presidents, your leaders, to be people of the most extraordinary personal integrity and moral character. And then, if you have someone like George Washington and he comes to us and says, look, there isn't time for me to go to Congress. This is really important. I'm going to do this on behalf of the future of this country. Then we will defer to him, for a time at least. But if it's Aaron Burr, why would we defer to him? He's an adventurer. I wouldn't defer to Hamilton. He's a warmonger. And so, yes, there has to be some discretion to save the country in times of absolute emergency. And sometimes government does know things that the people are not yet in possession of the knowledge wherewith to make good decisions. But I'm for as many controls on the war-making powers of the United States government as possibly we can invent.
Well, lastly, sir, in the moments we have left, I wanted to ask you about education. Your views on education during your time were considered provocative by many, but you believed in an engaged and informed citizenry and that education should be an institution locally controlled. Do I have it right?
Yes, that government is best which is closest to your own home. And education is a complex thing because it's partly based in family. We educate our children in our nurseries. We educate people around the kitchen table. We educate people around the fireplace. We also then create educational systems, and they should be public, in my opinion, because public education brings in everybody, not just the elite. Education is essential. In fact, I would say that education is very nearly the elixir. In other words, it's very nearly the universal answer to all human problems. Give me a set of human problems and turn me loose with public education done by truly gifted educators. And I promise you that almost all human problems will be solved. It's ignorance, obscurantism, the desire by church authorities to keep people in superstition, the desire by government to keep people from transparency in the workings of government. This is what creates chaos and madness and war and class struggles. When there is transparency and when the people are well informed and able to think for themselves, almost all human problems will disappear like the fog when the sun rises in the morning.
Thank you so very much for sharing your views on your core principles this week, Mr. Jefferson. I have enjoyed this conversation.
You are certainly welcome, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation. Well, at least this week it was our weekly conversation with President Jefferson. And we are now joined by the gentleman who portrays Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And this was interesting. This came from a gentleman who bears mention, Tom Bergen. He suggested that we talk to Mr. Jefferson about some of his core principles, his core beliefs. And so it's a conversation we haven't had before.
Now, Tom and I met in France. He was on the French cultural tour that I led in September and October. And he's an extraordinary man. And he came up to me one day on the bus and said he had an idea for a program. I'm always delighted when that happens. And although he had a slightly different program in mind, we still are talking about the core principles of Jefferson. And so I really want to thank Tom for his suggestion and his input on all of this. I just so enjoy the cultural tours, and the people who come on them are largely people from the Jefferson Hour. And a lot of them have had a fair amount of exposure to Jefferson's ideas. And so many of them regard themselves as Jeffersonians. Now, there's the odd Hamiltonian among them, but most of the people that come on these journeys have been inspired by Thomas Jefferson into wanting a more Jeffersonian life. And that's certainly true of Tom. And I so appreciate the suggestion that he made. David, so many things come to mind from this program, so I just want to begin here, and I know you have some thoughts too. War. Think of the Iraq War. We went into the Iraq War on what turned out to be false pretenses, that there were weapons of mass destruction and we must urgently prevent them from being used. This may have been a set of lies. It was certainly wishful thinking, and I think the American public was skeptical of this idea. They were pretty skeptical of this rationale for the war. But we went along with it. The war soon turned sour. We didn't really know Sunni from Shia, and we were able to displace Saddam Hussein, but we didn't realize the madness, the pandemonium, the utter breakdown of the social order in Iraq that would soon follow. And it became a nightmare, and the American people grew less and less willing to keep this war going. And finally, public opinion was such that we had to pull out. And by pulling out, we left things in even a worse condition. In some limited sense, Iraq would have been better had we never gone at all. If Jefferson's system prevailed and President G.W. Bush had come to the American people and said, I've decided that we need to invade Iraq. I think there are weapons of mass destruction there. I'll try to convince you that that's true, and I need you each to take out your checkbooks and write a check for $78,500. That's about what this thing is going to cost, and there may be cost overrun, so I may be back. But we can't fight this unless you reach into your pockets and pay a surcharge to the government of the United States, because this thing has to get funded. If that had happened, there would have been no war in Iraq. The American people would have said, you have to be a lot more convinced of clear and present danger to the very security of the United States to want to spend $78,000. So that's what Jefferson had in mind, that people are all too willing to go to war, and the Iraq War is a perfect example of that. Governments are all too willing to go to war. Look what Putin has done in Ukraine. I'm not making the moral equivalence. And by going to war in Iraq, we did a ruinous thing that destabilized the Middle East and set back the United States, maybe permanently, but certainly in a fundamental way. The people are wiser than that. The people would not have gone along with this, and they particularly would not have gone along with this if they knew that they'd have to pay for it. The only reason that we get away with this kind of maneuvering in the 21st century and the late 20th century is that we just print money. We just borrow money. And so, of course, if you say to the people, we're going to invade Iraq, but it's not going to change anything. There won't be any rationing. You have all the gasoline you want. The prices in the stores will remain the same. Your taxes won't go up. All we're going to do is borrow a bunch of money and do this. So, don't worry about it. Go about your business. That makes it so easy to accept. But if the people thought, do I want to spend my annual salary to fund a war of dubious legitimacy, they would have said, we're not doing it. Or convince us that this is a just war. And so I'm with Jefferson 100% on this. It just seems to me that when we have a constitutional revision, and we desperately need one, reining in the dogs of war is one of the most important things we can do. Think of it, David. You and I are about the same age. We grew up at the end of the Korean War. We lived through the nightmare of the Vietnam War. Then there's been the repeated wars in the Middle East. And what have we accomplished in any of them? What's the best thing that can be said of all of these ruinous wars that the United States has fought since 1960?
Profit.
You think it's munitions and profit and the economy and capitalism.
There's a statement you've made in the course of these many years of doing this show that just keeps ringing in my ears, and it's Adam saying, have you looked around, Mr. Jefferson? So let me say, have you looked around, Mr. Jenkinson? It's a wonderfully optimistic viewpoint to say, well, okay, you open your checkbooks, or we're not going to do that. That's never going to happen.
Why is that wonderfully optimistic? Why wouldn't that be baseline economics?
I love it. I think it's great. And I think people should understand where their tax dollars go, and maybe they would rise up, and maybe they would say, well, that's good. Government's never going to give back that much power to citizens.
Then we're not a republic.
Citizens are never going to push that hard to have that much power. You might, but have you looked around, Mr. Jenkinson?
I don't agree with your cynicism on this. And you are an idealist.
It's not cynicism. It's it's realistic.
Let's move on. So I've made my point, and I've made it as strongly as I can, and it's a purely Jeffersonian point.
And I love it. And I'm so glad that you said it. And it pains me to have to take the other side, but hey, it's radio.
It's radio. So the second thing is slavery. It had to come up today because Jefferson's going on and on about self-reliance, and the ideal citizen takes care of everything he needs in his life and so on. And you think, well, he owns other human beings. And so it just, this led to one of the most hilarious moments in the history of the Jefferson Hour before your time, when Bill Kristol was the host back in Reno, and we were going over Jefferson's 10 commandments. And one of them is never ask another to do what you can do for yourself. And when we got to it, we both started laughing. We couldn't help ourselves. I mean, it was spontaneous. We thought, what? How could Jefferson have written that down when he had 600 human beings working for him in the course of his life? And then another one was never spend your money before you have it. And at that point, it broke down completely. And there was actually like a 15-minute period where we were just giggling and laughing, and beside us crying. The tears were coming down our cheeks, and we had to actually cut out 92% of it. But even then, it's a famous program because people heard that the hypocrisy that, humans we are all inconsistent. We all have a lot to answer for. None of us can look in the mirror with full attention. That in varying degrees, we're hypocrites and we're inconsistent and we have blind spots and prejudices and weaknesses and neuroses and so on. Everybody, every single human being, some more than others. I plenty. And if you look in the mirror rigorously, it's really rough to go on. But when Jefferson could live with such a wall of separation between his rational, utopian, imaginative life, which I adore, and then his practical existence, which never ask another to do something you can do for yourself. I mean, what is the absolute other end of the spectrum from that except slavery?
If you were asking for my counsel, I would say, again, have you looked for human beings are complicated. They just are. I mean, think of great artists that you admire, great authors that you admire, and there's darkness in all of us, more in some of us than others.
No question. I'm just saying that.
But back to Jefferson, all of these great things, people are sovereign. He wanted limited government. He wanted individual self-reliance. He wanted fiscal responsibility in government, national independence, entanglements with none. These are all good things.
And character. When you asked about, aren't there times when government must be trusted? And then Jefferson says, yeah, if everyone were George Washington, if everyone had that kind of character, but of course they don't. And today we have senators who are buying and selling stocks minutes before the pandemic shuts down the American economy. We live with this, and they get away with it. And even when the Senate Ethics Committee looks at them, they kind of slap their hand a little or say that it's too ambiguous. There isn't anything there. There's nothing there. And so we live in this time when corruption is routinely accepted. Donald Trump was charging the Secret Service double, triple, 5 times the usual rate at his hotels. The corruption is routinely accepted in this country now.
I agree with you. And we've just been through the election. We had that delightful conversation last week with Lindsay Travinsky and you talking about the election. And we don't have a lot of statesmen that, I don't know if we ever have, or if there's just a few that have really stood out, but it's not like there are leaders who have put the nation's interests above all other things and that are eloquent and can speak out, which, occasionally we do get emails about, when are you going to run for office, Clay?
Yeah, well, if they give me I'll start with the ranch and then the $60 million. I'm 10. You said we spent $16 billion on this election. I'll take a fraction of that. I would love to be a statesman.
That was a great point that we just kind of let go in that last discussion. And it was, according to the New York Times, the article I read, $16.7 billion on the elections. And then you pointed out the National Endowment. Yeah, that bears repeating. Could you do that?
Yeah, the NEH, my favorite public agency, which funds the State Humanities Councils. It funded Chautauqua. It funded the work that I do. There's a footprint of the NEH everywhere in this country. It funds Ken Burns films and other documentaries. It funds museum exhibits. The lecture series in your community is probably in part funded by the State Humanities Council of your state. And it does this noble work on about under $200 million per year. And so then you have an election in which people are saying, it was all a lie, the election was stolen. No, it wasn't. Yes, it was. I tell you, the election was stolen. Oh, that's great. That's what passes for debate in the country. And here's another thing about that. The election that just happened, David, $16.7 billion worth. How much did this country talk about global climate change and how to decide what weight to give it in our public councils? I mean, some people think this is the existential issue of our times. I'm not sure that that's true, but it is certainly one of the existential issues of our times. And almost no debate or dialogue occurred on this subject in the United States of America after spending $16.7 billion in this election. Great nations talk about the things that they need to talk about. Immigration is one of them. Global climate change and global warming is another. The plight of our rivers in the American West, related to climate change, of course, is another. Forest fires. I mean, we need to be talking about these huge things that are challenges to the very survival of our republic, much less the happiness of the American people. And instead, if I went to 5 or 6 cities in the course of the campaign, and each time I turned on the television and watched the local ads, and it was as if Adolf Hitler on one side were competing against Stalin on the other side. The ads were so over the top in the vilification, and if you vote for this criminal, civilization on earth will end. We are a frivolous nation, and to call us a republic is just a contradiction in terms. And when you say, have you looked around that quoting me, pretending to quote Adams, I disagree with this on this question. A republic can only work if there is a relatively high level of civic virtue. And they don't all have to be George Washington or Cincinnatus, but it only works if there is a relatively high level of integrity and character in our leaders. Without that, you can't have it. Then you need a more authoritarian government if you're not prepared to have people of character. And we don't. You and I could name 5 or 10 people of character in our national politics if we struggled at it for an hour or two. But any given roster of these people is going to show that they're schnooks, that they're cowards, that they're cretins, that they don't do their homework, that they're lazy, that they're corrupt. And that sounds pretty powerful, but it is true.
Earlier, I made some comment in reference to radio. I'm wondering if we're still on. I'm glad for that rant. I appreciate it, and I'm glad you got it out, and I pretty much agree with it. But let's go back to Jefferson's core principles.
That's it. That's what this came from, because if you outline these principles, and I get to be Jefferson, and I get to lay out the ideal society per war, per taxes, per government, per character, per education, and we lay out these beautiful utopian concepts, then there's a deflation when you actually do look around and realize, oh, it's all broken. All those beautiful things that Jefferson says make for a great society, they lift me. They make me want to live in Jefferson's world. They want me to live in a Jeffersonian republic without slavery. And then you look around at the world that actually exists, and you feel like Jonathan Swift, savage indignation when you see the abuse of those ideals in our time. And so, yes, I agree with you. Let's stick with Jefferson here. But you see, of course, that it's a judgment of us.
Yes, but there are bright points. There are those who do good work and help their communities and worry about the right things. So as we come to a close for this week, I want to thank you and Mr. Jefferson, as always, for a really good conversation. I hope people enjoyed it and took it in the right spirit. And leave us, if you would, sir, with some of your famous Jeffersonian optimism.
I believe in this country. I believe that our Bill of Rights is one of the most extraordinary documents in the world. I believe that we strain, and that there is a very substantial percentage of the American people that want to live in Jefferson's republic and work at it and strain at it and give parts of their lives to it. I was in voting the other day in Bismarck, North Dakota, and some people I know were sitting at the desk in the polling place, and they gave their whole day to helping people find the right documents and to ease them into the system and to explain what was about to happen. And they weren't paid for this. They believe in democracy, and so they gave a portion of their week to make it possible for people to come and effortlessly or nearly effortlessly take on their civic obligation of voting. When I saw that, I thought, that's what we need. They did that because they believe in our system and they know that it's in trouble. And there are millions of such people around this country, David, and you are one of them. And so, of course, there's reason for optimism, but the forces of darkness are extremely rich and powerful, and we're going to have to really address that.
As always, thank you so much, sir.
We'll see you all next week for another edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.